It's my honor this morning to introduce you to Janine, Dr. Janine Hill Fletcher. Dr. Hill Fletcher is a constructive theologian whose research is at the intersection of Christian systematic theology and issues of diversity, including gender, race, and religious diversity. She is the author of 3 books that examine the intersectional realities of religious diversity, including her most recent, The Sin of White Supremacy: Christianity, Racism, and Religious Diversity in America. She is professor of theology at Fordham University in the Bronx and board member of the grassroots social justice organization, the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, an intergenerational, multiracial, multi-religious group organizing to address social justice issues in New York City and beyond. I first became aware of Dr. Hill Fletcher's work when I came across her most recent book, The Sin of White Supremacy. Motivated me to Google her, and I found a video where she described an experience she had as part of a service learning project, where she took primarily white students from a predominantly white university to visit a neighborhood whose demographic was largely Latino and Black. The students went into the work and experienced it as problems the community had. If only the teachers could teach better. If only the kids behaved better. If only the parents cared more. She realized that service learning programs cannot send white students and white faculty into communities of color without a mindset, without an analysis of the problems of racial injustice, of the histories of racial. Said that twice. They're not individual problems, they're social problems, they're communal problems, they're historical problems. Doesn't this remind you of Paulo Freire's words in Pedagogy of the Oppressed when he says, "The oppressed are regarded as the pathology of the healthy society, which must therefore adjust these incompetent and lazy folk to its own pattern by changing their mentality. These marginal need to be integrated, incorporated into the healthy society that they have forsaken." The truth is, however, that the oppressed are not marginals, are not people living outside society. They have always been inside the structure which made them beings for others. The solution is not to integrate them into the structure of oppression, but to transform that structure so that they can become beings for themselves. This afternoon, Dr. Samuel Torres will build upon this morning's conversations when he provides the historical and philosophical foundations of dominant colonial constructions of the West and how those led to Indian boarding school policies and education for assimilation. Freire reminds us that in the process of dehumanization, not only are the oppressed dehumanized, but so are the oppressors. Dr. Hill Fletcher writes in her book that if good white Christians want to see changes in the world of racial harmony, they must work for racial justice. Justice will not come from individual acts of charity, but will require the transformation of our social structures. Transforming unjust social structures is not their problem alone, but ours together. Thank you for being here. And here's Dr. Hill Fletcher.
Thank you, Wendy, for that beautiful introduction, and thank you for welcoming me into this conversation. I'm going to share my screen and just confirm that you can see my title slide. So I need a few folks to nod that yes, that's what you're seeing. And also just to let you know and to confirm that the schedule for this first session here is about an hour. That I will present, in order to keep to our time together, I'm going to present a portion of the material that I have prepared in about, I'd say about 20 minutes-ish. And if I keep to my my text, I will be right on target with that. And that at the end of the first section of what I do what we do together, what I present, I'll ask you to I'll take a little break and take a look at questions that might be emerging in the chat. But I'd welcome you to begin that process of thinking with each other and thinking with me as I narrate this first part of the work that we'll do together. So please do feel free I think the chat function should be available. If it's not, we'll flag someone down to make sure that it is. And go ahead and put your questions in the chat, even your thoughts in the chat. I'll take a little mini break to look at those questions and answer some of the clarifying questions. I'll continue then with the additional work that I have prepared, and then we'll really revisit this only after a full conversation with panelists responding and time for question and answer. So I begin. Invited into this day's rethinking ourselves in a time of truth and healing. And my focus is on the legacy of Christian supremacy. As a Christian theologian, I've met many Christians who sincerely desire healing for our world. They read in their sacred text and they hear in their worship communities the deep values of love for one another and commitment to truth and justice. These values have sustained Christian communities for over 2,000 years. But what if the foundational knowledge of our search for truth and justice is faulty? What if our attempts to love can't be successful because the soil out of which they grow is rocky and unable to sustain the deep roots that love requires? Drawing from my own experience and the many students and congregations with whom I've worked, I've begun to sense that one aspect of the rocky soil in which white Christian love is rooted is a misspoken narrative of our own history. In order to love, in order to seek truth and healing that we desire, we need to rethink our history and ourselves within it. As a theologian, I know that the story of my faith is often told as the story of steady progress toward the telos, or goal, of Jesus as the kind of human we want to be. And the Christians tell their story of moving closer and closer to their better humanity in following him. This leads Christians also sometimes to tell history as if that was also a journey of seeing Christian progress leading us ever closer to our better humanity. Take, for example, what many students inherit from their education around civil rights in this country. They come into my classroom thinking, of course it was bad under the systems that enslaved human beings. But they often feel as though they've been taught that the march of civil rights made things progressively better, and we simply need to keep moving forward. It's that kind of a story that we're told in our history classes that infuses our theologies too, that misunderstands the realities and struggles of the past. And so I try to tell a different story, a story of US history not rooted in steady progress toward greater humanity, but a story of struggle, where at each stage of US history, white Christians used their sacred text, their vision of Jesus, and their belief in God's will to actually dehumanize others. And that in that process, in each chapter, we see this struggle for full humanity in resistance to that way of narrating Christian history. It's this story of the Christian use of their own history, our own theology, that needs to be faced, I think, as truth before healing can begin. This is the story that shows us the legacy of Christian supremacy, and it's the story I'll attempt to unfold in our few minutes together today. The US story as an ideology of Christian supremacy shaping the creation of the nation actually begins in Europe in the era of colonial exploration. After nearly 800 years of Muslim, Christian, Jewish, cultural, and religious mixing, the Iberian Peninsula had been reclaimed as a Christian nation, and now competed with other Christian nations for trade routes to the east. So began the era of exploration. Christians of the early modern period read each so-called discovery as evidence of God's favor upon them. In the words of Pope Alexander VI, the project of Columbus, financed by Ferdinand and Isabella, consisted in the spread of Christian rule as a holy and praiseworthy purpose, so pleasing to immortal God. God was pleased, Alexander reasoned, that the so-called barbarous nations were overthrown at home, and now the Christian religion could be exalted and everywhere increased and spread. This Christendom mentality, European Christians thought of themselves as carrying out God's design for humanity. They use the biblical text as a warrant to justify their expansion, seeing in the text of Genesis 1:28, God's directing European Christians to fill the earth and subdue it. Arriving in new places around the globe, Christians did not see indigenous nations and peoples as active participants in God's plan, except insofar as they would be converted to Christianity. This was the orienting truth of coloniality, that lands and people would be brought under Christian domination and control, and this was underwritten by Christian theological texts of the day. Of course, this framework, which dominated a European Christian mentality in the era of exploration and colonization, is not the only way of framing our being in the world. In fact, George Tinker has described the deep cultural differences that might capture this clash of coloniality. He describes very powerfully that a European Enlightenment mindset, informed by the rise of science and control over the created world, was shaping Christian colonists from out of their own systems of education to think of themselves as individuals who carried out God's plan of progress and in ownership of the land, controlling it for their purposes. For many Western thinkers and those of us shaped by Enlightenment patterns of thought, this seemed reasonable and even the right way for humans to relate to one another and to the earth. But Tinker asks us to see clearly a different worldview in an indigenous wisdom that relates to a rhythm rather than progress, that reflects an attachment to the earth in a community of interrelation and not individualisms. But European Christians saw indigenous ways of relating to the earth as not carrying out the plan for humanity that God had put in place. At the same time that European Christian nations were expanding their reach around the globe, European Enlightenment thinkers, the best educators of their day, were developing ideas about the very nature of the people who were being conquered and whose lands were being colonized. Back in Europe, it was botanists like Linnaeus and philosophers like Kant and Hegel who were manufacturing ideas as knowledge, as information in the education systems of their days, manufacturing ideas about the variety of peoples around the globe and creating categories to sort them into. Like the botanists' categories that would control the natural world, only this time they were creating categories to control humanity. When Christian colonists used the framework of the races to assess the projects they found in the land they claimed as America, they fit indigenous peoples into a different racial category than the one that they had constructed for themselves. The fabricated nature of the races, as lined out in this chart here, it just gives you a sense of how different theorists were categorizing people in different ways. The fabricated nature of the races is evident in this period, and their changeability can be seen in the ways that European Christians and now American Christians framed the indigenous people in various ways, identifying them as guides, as trading partners, as Indians, as natives, but also as savages, barbarians, and pagans. Historians can demonstrate how indigenous people became racialized when they refused Christian missionary advancement. The crimson paint of their religious practices turning their skin permanently red in the eyes of white Christians. The racialized assessment of indigenous peoples as a race of savages outside the pale of God's law was a trope that sustained US advancement and broken treaties from the founding of the nation to the nation's expansion across the land. What's so important for me at this point as an educator is to recognize that these were educational systems produced in Europe, adopted in the Americas, and taken as truth. So that when European Christians looked through their most educated worldviews and saw the practices of indigenous peoples, they assessed that indigenous peoples had gotten it all wrong, and that it must be on account of their race, that they didn't know God's plan and didn't follow the command of Genesis to fill the earth and subdue it. By the beginning of the 19th century, legislators reasoned that because of this failure on the part of indigenous peoples to carry out God's plan of progress and control of the earth, the land rightly belonged instead to the expanding Christian nation. We hear a foundational Christian supremacy when the future President John Quincy Adams asks, "What is the right of the huntsman to the forest of 1,000 miles over which he has accidentally ranged in quest of prey? Shall the fields and valleys which a beneficent God has formed to teem with the life of innumerable multitudes be condemned to everlasting barrenness?" Or the words of then Governor William Henry Harrison, "Is one of the fairest portions of the globe to remain in a state of nature, the haunt of a few wretched savages when it seems destined by the Creator to give support to a large population, to be the seat of civilization, of science, and of true religion." I appreciate that we've been forewarned that this is difficult work. I find it painful to read the words of my Christian forebears, but I think it's important to recognize the ways in which these tropes were passed down by the most powerful members of a Christian society at this time. A prominent member of a prominent Christian minister and educator in the Minnesota Territory in 1852 described the situation this way. This is a minister who is founding systems of schools and universities. And so to hear that this is our heritage as educators and those of us who are Christian is something I think that is the beginning of our wrestling. This Christian minister and educator wrote and published and distributed the history of his place with these words: "The white race stood upon this undeveloped continent, ready and willing to execute divine injunction, to replenish the earth and subdue it. On the one side stood the white race armed with its law, on the other the savage, resisting the execution of the law. It was a conflict of knowledge with ignorance, of right with wrong. The Indian races were in the wrongful possession of a continent required by the superior right of the white man. This educator saw the systems of education as bringing God's plan for humanity to this new land. The very project of building institutions and expanding a nation ordained by God and foretold in Christian scripture. Backed by military presence and the wealth of a white nation, God's plan for humanity could take root and flourish. As the nation eyed ever expanding territory, the words of Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton captured the religio-racial project of Christian supremacy when he announced in 1848, it would seem that the white race alone received the divine command to subdue and replenish the earth. The regularity with which Christian lawmakers, preachers, and educators used this phrasing from Genesis, subdue the earth, reflects to me that this trope had become part of the white Christian story and even part of white Christian education systems. And as Stephen Newcomb has demonstrated, the logic of Christian supremacy was written into US law in 1823 with the Supreme Court decision of Johnson versus McIntosh, which reasoned not only has the practice of all civilized nations been in conformity with the doctrine of Christian discovery, but the whole theory of their title to lands in America rests upon the hypothesis that the Indians had no right of soil as sovereign independent states. Discovery is the foundation of title in European nation, and this overlooks all proprietary rights in the natives, end quote. This decision determined that Christian nations had the right to discovery, and this superseded indigenous nations' right to occupancy, and that by purchase or conquest, the land would rightly belong to white Christians. This truth and knowledge, information about the protocol that had been laid down, framed US law and informed US policy, seeing the transfer of land through the US government into the hands of white settlers. The colonial mindset, even after the colonial period, continued as the US acquired more land in the aggressive action of the Mexican-American War. As this map shows, prior to 1848, the land of the West and Southwest had been claimed by Spain and newly decolonized to become the United States of Mexico, but now was claimed by the United States of America. As painful as it is to read this map, created in 1805, associating the land with its Christian nations, we have to see this again as part of the system of education that was passed down in the very naming of the nations associated with the land. And we add to that pain, the pain of simply reading this map, when we remember that the US, in its expansion in this era, in the middle of the 19th century, was still propelled by an economy under which somewhere between 4 and 10 million people worked to build the nation through industry, innovation, and agricultural production, but did not reap the benefits of their labor. Under the economy of enslavement, white Christians again reasoned with their scripture that the supremacy of Christianity justified the kidnap and capture of African peoples to bring them to the higher knowledge of Christian culture and Christian religion. So Christian supremacy had a devastating effect on the original nations of this land, but also on those who were enslaved to help build and expand the United States of America. Dwelling on the pain of this period, a pain caused by Christian supremacy, we remember also the experience of Asians in America at this time. As the nation built industry to expand its reach, the nation needed more workers to build itself up. Like many other immigrant groups during this period, Chinese and Japanese workers sought the opportunities being promoted by the US in recruiting people to help settle the land and build up the nation. An act of Congress made a transcontinental railway system possible, and private industry met in Utah in 1860, and private industry drew the new immigrants in, recruiting them from their homelands and inviting them to help build up the nation. By the time the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads met in Utah in 1869, the Central Pacific had recruited thousands of additional workers directly from China. When the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, Chinese laborers made up over 90% of Central Pacific's workforce. But an ideology of Christian supremacy was woven into the debates over whether these same Christian laborers who built the nation and its industry would be welcomed as citizens. Senator A.A. Sargent entered this debate with the idea that the command of Scripture is this: go ye into the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Not overwhelm your own family, your own neighborhood, your own nation with the effects of heathenism. Let the missionary go to China and convert these men from their heathenish practices, wash their robes and make them white in the blood of the Lamb, and then, being fit for American citizenship and to become an integral part of our society, then let them come as immigrants. Until then, they deteriorate our body politic and destroy our civilization. This image on the right reminds us of the pain of white supremacy that saturated the culture and asks us to rethink the history that is our heritage in those that built Spokane as an American city in the late 19th and early 20th century. If the trope of an era of encounter or invasion was to subdue the earth, The regular phrase of white Christian ministers, educators, and lawmakers in the era of expansion was that it was the task of a white Christian nation to uplift and civilize, and that the project of Christian education could be instrumental in this task. As just one example of how this trope might function, in the speeches and writings of the day, the Reverend Alexander Mackenzie at the 1893 World's Parliament of Religions celebrated the American Christian project of, quote, taking the Black material of humanity and building it up into noble men and women, taking the red material wild with every savage instinct and making it into respectable men. The system of government-sponsored, Christian-run boarding schools is precisely within this moment of the nation's project. The Christian history of America as a nation up to this point has been a story of white Christian supremacy, mobilized to dispossess indigenous nations from the land, to enslave African and African-descended peoples in order to build up white wealth and industry, and to exclude those who had been categorized as Asian from reaping the benefits of citizenship in the nation that they helped to build. In all three cases, the very categorization of people as pagan and as a race outside the race of white Christians was a crucial component in this dehumanizing project of nation building. This is the reality of Christian supremacy, woven into education systems, woven into legislation that laid the foundation for the nation in its earliest eras. It was an ideology of white Christian supremacy that marched progress across the land, establishing industry and cities and white civilization. Backed by the military arm of a white Christian nation, white industry and white wealth, white well-being could be secured, even as wealth building and well-being were denied people of color and people of other faiths. While the march of progress of a European heritage white Christian nation tells the story of this era of expansion in the success of its settlements and its industry and its schools, the Spokane Tribal website describes this march differently. In 1858, with no treaty established or adequate communication from the federal government, the Spokanes defended their families and country as US soldiers marched through their country. Land secured by the military, transferred to a white Christian nation, could be further distributed as benefits to white citizens, as it was in the 1862 Homestead Act. And industry could be established with the wealth of white citizens, while white Christian progress was guaranteed. So I want to pause at this point in my story and see if there are questions of clarification. Give me a chance to take a step back and to breathe and to see if you have seen the project I'm attempting to lay out. That education and theological ideas were interwoven with nation building and military support that gave rise to white industry, and that we might have experienced our own education as telling a story of progress in those various chapters. So I just want to pause and see if you're with me so far, right? What questions might you have, about the creation of the categories of the races, right? Are there questions that you have about that as an educational project in the era of the Enlightenment? Did your education ever frame an economy of enslavement in such a way that would require you to ask, where did the money go? One of the things from an educator's perspective that I realized with this history is that it has been a process of re-education for me. Surely I knew about the era of enslavement. I'm not sure I thought about it as an economic system, and I really did not ask the question until adulthood, where did all that money go? right? Well, it went into white industry, it went into white wealth, it went into white institutions. So if there are other questions around that history or how we're educated in that history, maybe we take a few minutes to take a look at that. I certainly knew nothing. I don't know what, so I'm 50 years old. Those of you who are educators can trace your way back. I think I'm actually 52, but in any case, trace your way back to the systems of education when I was growing up. I knew nothing about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It just wasn't part of the curriculum. My students, as they come in, do know this piece of history. So the question of how important it is to have curricular changes is a question, I think, in a pedagogy of hope. It's not just looking back on this history, it is also recognizing our responsibility in the way we create curriculum to narrate this history. So I'll just give a minute here. I'm a little nervous to look at the questions in the chat, but it will give us a time to not simply be the direction, my own direction here. Okay. Oh, I don't know. That's a great, these are great questions. Okay. Okay. All right. So someone asks, Julianne asks, the question about subdue and replenish the earth. So you've just asked that question to someone trained in the theological traditions, where I would turn to biblical scholars and I would say, okay, what did it mean in its origins? How might it be interpreted or translated in various ways? What we see in educators and legislators and thinkers and ministers of the early colonial period is that subdue and replenish was connected directly with building up of white civilization. Right, so it had something to do, the way that they interpreted seemed to be that God designed, right, and God asked human beings in the Genesis account to take control of the earth. Right, what it meant in its origins, I would have to look at what biblical scholars have to say about that. But we can see the way that so many in this early Christian era, in this early American era, were using Genesis like almost as the exact frame all the way through to think about their own project of subduing the earth, bringing it under control, and building up, right, law, education, civilization, etc. So perhaps that helps, and maybe some biblical scholars can give us a sense of whether that's a misinterpretation or not. I'm glad to see that we are paying attention, not paying attention, but I'm glad to see that you're hearing already the question of reparation, that each of these eras is an era in which Christian theology underwrote legislation that directed resources to white Christians and citizens. And so the ways in which we think about this history as a transfer of resources is, I think, important. Myself as well didn't realize that the Japanese and Chinese workers were actually recruited. And the Bracero program, yes. So as we continue, you're all on the right page here, as we continue the history, and I don't go into the 20th century in what I'm presenting here. I do that in other places where I've tried to think about how this pattern that's laid down in the early eras of the nation created legislation that built up white wealth, transferred the work, transferred the land, transferred the resources to citizens, and that citizenship itself was directed in this period toward free white persons, right? And so the construction of the races, the way that the construction of the races was informed by and informing legislation. And then the nation continues these sorts of projects when the US annexes the land from the United States of Mexico, lays down these economic ties, lays down these ties of migration, but also then requires and invites laborers in the Bracero program in the 20th century. This same sort of a project goes on even beyond this era of where I've arrived so far. My first two chapters are the era of encounter, the era of enslavement, the era of expansion, and then do these continue right into even our own era is a question that I'm glad to see already on the chat. Any questions for clarification before I'm glad to see questions and thoughts. So Elaine asks, where were the legislators who did not view themselves as Christian? How do you view them as contributing to the project where Christian theology underwrote legislation? A great question. The reality in this early era is that legislators and ministers and educators, for the most part, did see themselves as Christian, right? And so I don't have the exact data to be able to say this is the exact numbers, but the sense in which members of the body politic were Christian, right? And that legislators understood themselves to be part of this Christian nation. I think that the balance of power, right, was that Christian legislators, that legislators were largely Christian. So this is kind of a finer point to ask the question, were there legislators who distanced themselves, right, from Christian identity or from Christianity or Christendom as a project? And what I have seen that has surprised me, and I name it a little bit further on, my students still, so this is a task for all of us as educators, my students still walk into a college classroom and say, oh, well, in the US, there's a separation of church and state. It's like, well, when you read legislators of this early period, when you read even legislators in later periods, right? The logic of Christianity, right? The logic of America as a Christian nation is absolutely woven into the debates on the floors of Congress, right? So the question of the question of where and what kind of Christian identities might have been supporting the legislation in this era, it's just something that I have been incredibly surprised by in terms of when I look at legislation that is that has directed resources away from people of color, away from people of other faith traditions. That has been often, I don't know if I can say always, but it has been so often woven with Christian theological ideas. Okay, so I think that I better get back to my task at hand in order to ask whether we can continue here. I'm going to move the chat a little bit out of the way and hopefully come back to that when we have time moving on. And so I'll continue. One of the reasons that I believe I needed to be re-educated as an adult, I needed to be re-educated. I did not know this history before my own re-education, is that I think that my education was probably structured by what sociologist Joe Fagan describes as a white racial frame. With such a frame in place, people look out on the world with an interpretive lens that presumes white virtuousness and the rightness of white action, grounded in a worldview that presumes white actions as carrying out a universal law, a natural law, the better way of being, or even a divine plan. The presumption of the white racial frame is that leads to the conclusion that white actors are in the right. When we look back on our landscape of history, do we see also, and do we buy into, and have we been educated to see progress and law and education and institutions as unfolding as the best plan for humanity and even God's plan for humanity. So this white racial frame, I think, continues to shape many of the ways that education is set up and that our history is told. And I've told the narrative of the United States up to this point because it brings me to a place where we can think together about the relationship of this history to our institutional histories within the network of Jesuit colleges and universities. Because it's within this dynamic history that many of our colleges and universities were founded. I also want to just insert here, going off script, hopefully not losing my train of thought. I also want to insert here that I have been trained to think about history along the lines of individuals. I've been attempting to think about history along the lines of systems, of legislation and structures. But I also am wanting to now think about my own location within an institution as a network. I'm really, I was really excited when Wendy offered the invitation to think with you, right? I wish I was up in the Northwest, right? I'm in New York City, but we are connected somehow in this system of Jesuit education. And I really want to think about the relationships that these institutions had to one another in this era, and the relationships that these institutions continue to have with one another in this era. And so I just want to name that this slide here to me is compelling, right? Because I've been wrestling a lot with my own history at Fordham. I know that Georgetown has wrestled a lot with its own history. The institutions in the Midwest have been wrestling with their history. And I think we need to begin wrestling with these histories together across the network of the institutions. So that's my invitation when we start, as we continue to think together, to think about how, while I'm moving into this chapter here, narrating a little bit more of your history, that I don't see it disconnected from the wider history of Jesuit institutions. So private Catholic educational institutions that we were in our founding, that nevertheless might be rooted within an economy of enslavement and the project of nation building in the era of US expansion. As I already mentioned, we may like to tell the history, our story of US history in the trope of our day, a separation of church and state. In actuality, the separation of church and state only covers a very narrow set of content in US law and practice. In the era of nation building and expansion, church ministers could be acting very much as instruments of the state. And the War Department and industry were similarly conjoined. After Congress legislated on the Oregon Territory in 1848, it was the military arm of the US government that paved the way for the railway, which itself was a project of the US government securing settler access to the area. In 1869, the government assigned a military officer as agent to each of the, as an agent in tribal relations. But in 1870, Congress passed an act substituting as agents the ministers of the various religious denominations. So the ministers themselves could be in partnership with the arm of the military in establishing educational institutions, and they could be acting as government agents in this era as well. It's within these structures of nation building undertaken by industry, military, legislators, and Christian ministers that Father Joseph Cataldo brings the Jesuit mission to the Northwest. And here is where I am learning from what you have made available. And I welcome and invite those of you who know this history better to help us think about this moment that we've arrived at. Embedded, as you'll see, I've just taken a screenshot of one of your website panels embedded in a page on the Jesuit mission to cultivate a desire to, quote, serve the common good and give glory to God, end quote. Visitors to Gonzaga's website will find your description of this history. There's you see my little arrow there, right? We read that your Jesuit founder, Father Joseph Cataldo, wanted to build a school for the tribes that they were serving, and decided to look around the area of Spokane Falls, quote, because that would be a central point for our missions where we could build a large school for Indian children or even for white, if many should come to the country. At that time, or thinking back on that time, the Spokane Tribal website describes the Spokane tribe of Indian ancestors inhabited much of northeastern Washington, which consisted of approximately 3 million acres. At times, they extended their hunting, fishing, and gathering grounds into Idaho and Montana. Prior to the arrival of the U.S. Department of War, they lived as, quote, a river people, living a semi-nomadic way of life. Hunting, fishing, and gathering, all Creator had made available to them, end quote. So Father Cataldo wants to build a school, a large school for Indian children or even for white, if they should come to the country. Indeed, a white Christian government made it possible, not only possible, but profitable for white settlers to come. Some among them having built their family wealth within an economy of enslavement. Money from the government supported white industry of the railroads, and settlers were supported by government transfer of lands from indigenous nations, as the 1862 Homestead Act provided the transfer of land to white settlers at a low cost. At this time, the Chinese workers and African Americans would have been excluded from these purchases because they were not citizens. The Department of the Interior sold land to the Great Northern Railroad, and in 1881, Father Cataldo purchased 320 acres from the Great Northern Railroad. Soon after Cataldo's purchase, and this is from your website, the settlers in Spokane Falls wrote to Father Cataldo, asking him to build a college that would attract students from all parts of the West. James Glover, sometimes called the father of Spokane, gathered other settlers and sent Cataldo another letter pledging $2,650 to help build a college. This is in the same year in which President Rutherford B. Hayes established the Spokane Reservation. While your institutional home and mine are separated by the vast expanse of what had become the United States as a nation, it's not only the railroad and industry that connected us. The Jesuit network and the flow of ideas surely propelled our forefathers in the work. This image of the early Gonzaga Jesuits on the left, and the image of our first Jesuit president, Augustus Thiebaud, on the right. When Fordham's Jesuit president, Augustus Thiebaud, wrote from New York City about the indigenous nations, is it possible that he propelled the Jesuit missions to the Northwest with the same tropes that we have seen from Christian ministers and legislators of the day? Thiebaud writes about the Christian missions to indigenous nations in a series of articles over the years 1877 to 1881 in a Catholic periodical that purports to be a message for the healing of the nations. And Thiebaud describes his purpose in disseminating these articles of learning, of scholarship, for the benefit of others in their education as a reading audience. Here again, the place where I experience how hurtful this history is. Thiebaud describes the purpose of his scholarship in the series published in the Month and Catholic Review, a widely published and disseminated periodical of the time. He says that his main purpose in these papers on the indigenous peoples is to arrive at a just appreciation of the immense labors required by those zealous men who spent their life and often shed their blood to Christianize the North American races. It is always an affair of great difficulty to convert pagans to Christ, and the task is more arduous when the pagans to be converted are rude savages, degraded consequently from their primitive state. But a sufficient study of the Red Indian will prove that he was not only a pagan when the first Catholic missionaries came, not only a degraded savage, but in appearance totally unfit for a settled life, either as an agriculturalist, a fisherman, or even as a hunter, the wildest of all the pursuits of inferior tribes. Now, before a pagan can become a thorough Christian, he must be made, to a certain extent at least, a man of steady habits. Recall the theologic that opened my discussion, the biblical vision from Genesis to subdue the earth, and the interpretation that this meant a settled lifestyle of European law, education, and governance. Thibault wrote and published his articles in serial form from 1877 to 1881. How might this generation of scholarship across the Jesuit and Catholic network have had an impact on Jesuits in supporting the building of Gonzaga on the opposite coast? And how does this era form a legacy of Christian supremacy that we inherit even today? There must be some sort of an apology of the descendants of Augustus Thibault at an institution like mine that might be offered before any sort of healing begins. Because Augustus Thibault published these words to great acclaim and built up our Jesuit institution with the symbolic capital of erudition, scholarship, and theological truth. And Gonzaga might also want to feel the pain of an institution that aligned itself with the interests of a white Christian nation, not only serving white settlers, but also the military arm of the nation, asking ourselves the question, against whom was this military force being organized, and for the protection of whom? When we think about our histories within the systems and structures of white Christian supremacy, in theology and the media, in industry and education and scholarship, we might open up new places that we must wrestle with today, not only wrestling with the history of our past, but with what it has passed down as its legacy. If there are any thoughts that you want to put in the chat in this era of our history, I have about 10 minutes worth of questions, and maybe I should just continue on with my 10 minutes worth of questions. But I would be curious to know whether there are thoughts that come from this most recent chapter that I'm laying out. And we might be thinking together with both the history, right, and the ways in which we are encountering and passing on that history. As I turn to my final set of slides that are sort of open-ended and rhetorical questions for our moment. The eras of our history that I have narrated are eras that also shape our present moment, adding layers to the concern that Christian supremacy informed practices of white supremacy within institutions, and institutions that we ourselves are part of today. And there's something important about wrestling with our founding stories. The way in which we narrate this history and see this history is, I think, crucial for our present. In our present moment, our Jesuit institutions are wrestling with these histories. We are mobilizing our resources toward the crucially important work of anti-racism. As Brian Massingale the resources that have been made available with the AJCU are really important for us to engage and to work with and to think about how we as a network are developing those eyes to see. And in this, in the materials that have been made available, there are many, many really incredibly good questions for us to be thinking about and wrestling with as we're doing this anti-racism work. One among them is a video that narrates some of how this work is being done. And in it, Brian Massengale names clearly what I think the network can be on board with in seeing racism as the justice issue of our time. But even as I turn to the composition of place that was created in this video by the AJCU, I hear little of our institutional complicity through a rigorous account of our histories and the transfer of land and wealth from the eras of white Christian supremacy of the past. Racism is indeed a soul sickness, as Massengale names it, according to which we must change hearts and minds. But it has also been institutionalized in systems of education and industry that built up white wealth. Even as we work to become transformed and transforming institutions, we must reckon with our inheritance as institutions that have benefited from the legacies of white Christian supremacy. And so I'll close with a series of slides that we might take up as questions as we do this work as a network moving forward. As we're doing our anti-racism work, how do we face our histories? The fact that we've obtained land through settler colonialism, our institutions have built wealth through an economy of enslavement, and we've been embedded in US projects of expansion and militarism. If we had time, I'd send everyone to their websites and ask the question, do we tell our histories through a white racial frame of white Christian virtuousness? I'd invite you to the Fordham website to see the way that we tell our story through a frame of white virtuousness. It's pretty apparent there. But that's a question for all of us. How do we tell our stories? And our website is the first place to go. Look at our programming. Do we honor those who capitalize on US militarism and corporate capitalist exploitation? These rhetorical questions might give you a sense of those places that I'm wrestling with my own Jesuit institution. Look at our curricula. Do we dedicate resources to ensuring our histories are told? And that "our" is in quotation marks there, right? Do we have disciplinary expertise in each of these histories? At Fordham right now, we are attempting to dedicate resources to the establishment of an Asian American Studies program, right? Because we do not have the systems that elevate that history, and in the process, then we erase that history. I spent many years working with our service learning program, and I believe in our Jesuit mission of being contributing members and transforming our world. But do we leverage virtuousness to the eclipse of complicity? As I close here with these rhetorical questions, I also want us to think about how we as a Jesuit network of institutions could be doing transformative work. How could we model new ways of telling our history? I mean, one of the realities that my students have analyzed and brought to the fore, they say, well, our website is our marketing, right? That's how we market ourselves, right? Indeed. But could we model ways of marketing ourselves as institutions that are willing to grapple with this national history, right? We have possibilities as Jesuit institutions to mobilize our resources and dedicate them to telling the full range of our histories, identities, and cultures in this nation and in the world. And finally, how might we leverage our commitment in mission, our diversity, and our shared commitments to creating truly anti-racist, multicultural institutions? So I think that that's the end of my slides and the opening of either a chance to breathe or a chance to have conversation around these questions, because I've arrived at my additional slides. But I think that these are the questions that I would like to see us as a Jesuit network of institutions really making our next chapter in this history.